Hello. All right, this is our let's go back one. Probably our first, our last lecture, maybe our second to last lecture, art historical time period for art appreciation. On this one, we're talking about Romanticism, and I'm hoping that this will be a three-parter. I should be able to get this done in three kind of 8-minute segments. And talking about Romanticism, I guess first thing I want to say is that this lecture is going to go kind of quickly. We're going to just fly by a lot of these images because my primary point is to make sure that all of you see a lot of this and get an overall understanding of what Romanticism is as an art movement and as an aesthetic idea. But it's not necessarily about memorizing lots of information about each and every painting that we look at. So that's point number one. Point number two, the first thing we're going to do is kind of just talk about Romanticism in general. We've already seen in earlier lectures some hints at what I might call the Romantic spirit. Certain images like a landscape painting from Rembrandt that we looked at that had this kind of proto-romantic feeling about it. And so there has been sort of a suggestion about where aesthetics were going to go, and I am, and that's where we're going to start off. We're actually going to talk about some artists who, at the end of the 18th century, technically before the beginning of Romanticism, but who in some ways are kind of the precursors of Romanticism. We'll be talking about artists like Goya and artists like Fuseli and Blake. And so that's where we're going to start, but I want to just kind of cover Romanticism in general first. As I said, it's a big, huge topic, and it's kind of hard to wrap your head around, partially because the artwork is quite diverse. Like as we go through this lecture, we'll see artwork from a lot of different countries, and the artwork tends to not all look the same visually. But there are certain things that tie all of this together. A lot of it is on literary subject matter and thematic interests. Um, and there's certain kind of interests that we see a lot of in romantic art, like interest in tragic and catastrophic events, interest in the exotic or the grotesque, or the gothic, or the idealized past, or the fantastical. Um, and we also, in some of the romantic art, we see a certain kind of interest in very kind of gestural and bravuro kind of painting, but not everywhere. Um, so it is the themes and the the literary subject matter that more unifies Romanticism than the look of the artwork, the visuals. Um, okay, I think that covers most of what I wanted to say right at the beginning. And let's get to our first part, where we'll be talking about Goya. As I said, the first thing we're going to be talking about are some artists who are not necessarily romantics, or they kind of fit halfway in between things. Goya is, to a certain degree, um, more of a product of neoclassicism and a product of um, the Age of Enlightenment. But there is a dark, brooding spirit to Goya that is very romantic. Um, and although, if you look at a lot of his paintings, a lot of what he seems to do seems to be just kind of the basic work of a Spanish court painter, there is something a little bit more there, especially if you look at um, some of the later works where he's much more interested in what's going on in his country, in Spain, um, in the Civil War, and in his prints, like the Atrocities of War series that we've already talked about, or the Colossus that we've talked about here. Other kind of many of his prints are very kind of like these kind of dreamlike images. I think, yeah, we looked at one that was like that when we were talking about printmaking. Um, but also another thing that we see in Goya and some of Romantic painting is when it becomes topical, when it's interested in current events, it seems to be often in the areas where there's like really tragic and catastrophic events. We'll get back to that kind of theme again when we talk about the Raft of the Medusa. So that's Goya, and then next, jumping to England, and there will be a good deal of jumping around from one country to another, because the spirit of Romanticism does seem to kind of spread, but not in an even way. And Blake, I don't know. I guess I feel like he was a romantic, even though he started in the 18th century. There is a strong romantic feel to everything he does. And even though his artwork doesn't look like anybody else, it still is romantic artwork. And I guess the reason for that probably gets to the core of romantic aesthetics, which is the way the romantics thought about the artist as an individual, as a struggling individual who is a visionary, who often sees things completely differently than the way society does, or tastes and fashions of his time, and therefore the artist is often in contest with society. And Blake um, is emblematic of that, in that, what he was doing in his lifetime was so different from what anyone else was doing. Um, and one of the things also about Romanticism is that, because of its interest in the artist being a a visionary and an individual, it therefore also is more forgiving for, in some ways, for different kinds of manners and looks. Blake's artwork um, might not be accepted in many other times and places, but in this period, because he so perfectly um, is embodies this kind of spirit. Um, that yeah. And then another artist that I want to talk about, who is also kind of a sort of a prototype of the Romantic painter, is Henry Fuseli, um, who was born Heinrich. Oh shoot, I can't pronounce it in Swiss, but he's a Swiss emigre to England. Changed his name to Henry, and changed the spelling and pronunciation of Fuseli. Um, and like Blake, he was a strong influence on the Pre-Raphaelites. We'll talk about them towards the end of the lecture. And the what makes him romantic is a lot of the same reasons why um, Blake is romantic. That kind of like just that dogged individualism, that visionary quality of just doing what interests you, pursuing your idea wherever it takes you. But also, his paintings, in some ways, have a much more romantic look in their kind of dark palette, and um, and fantastical imagery. Especially this painting, which is one of those paintings that probably symbolizes, represents um, the Romantic era really well. I also want to take a little brief pause to just talk about um, that Romanticism as a spirit kind of, I think, seems to affect everybody, um, even people that maybe in some of their values and opinions were in many ways anti-romantic. Someone like Joseph Wright Derby, who we talked earlier about being kind of like the perfect age of enlightenment artist, an artist who was interested in scientists and bringing discoveries to the public. Um, but in a painting like this, you can see that there is this also this romantic spirit, a sense of you know a drama and a mystery about this cave, not treating it simply um, in a as a way of documenting it, but treating it um, as a place of narrative, or at least potential narrative. And that leads us to my last slide for this first part. We're talking about Friedrich, who, as the German, one of the German romanticists that we're going to be talking about today, he probably more than any other artist exemplifies Romanticism. And in this particular image right here, the image itself seems to be saying so much about the romantic idea of the artist, right? He is a lone wandering spirit. It is just, it's like a poem by Goethe, or like a sonata by Schubert or Schumann. You know, he is a wanderer. He's wandered the countryside, and he, you know, looks out. It's just him against nature. Um, anyway, we'll talk more about Friedrich in the next